Is it fair if transgender women take part in women's sport? There seems to be a growing backlash against the idea. So what are the arguments? And is there a solution that could satisfy everyone? Let's take a look. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemaker. In recent years, sporting bodies and the media has largely agreed the arguments of transgender activists that trans women athletes have a right to compete in competitions for women. But the last couple of years have seen this growing backlash. So recently, World Rugby said it was looking at banning trans women from taking part in women's rugby. Parents in American schools have been lobbying against them competing against their girls. And a few months ago, Idaho became the first state in the US to bar transgender athletes from participating in women's sports. Is it possible to step back from the rancor of the debate and take an objective look at what are the arguments, what's the evidence that supports them, and is there a way forward that would work for everybody? Well, let's give it a go. It's an issue that's gained prominence in recent years for several reasons. One, at the elite level, we've seen a few instances of transgender women athletes winning major titles, such as Rachel McKinnon, most famously winning the UCI Masters Track Cycling World Championship. This has led to complaints from some of the other women competitors, as well as people who simply look at the pictures of particularly mismatched participants. And of course, the more visually striking the mismatch, the more widely the image spreads and generates its reaction. And two, you have to be aware that there are some of the activists, and sometimes, but not always, including the trans athletes themselves, who adopt an aggressive campaigning posture that is quick to accuse people of bigotry for holding an opinion that's different to the one that says trans women should simply be allowed to take part in whatever they want. We've seen in all sorts of places that institutions are particularly intimidated by the possibility of being accused of prejudice, as are many individuals, and in the age of cancel culture with good reason. Some of the more confident public figures have stepped into the fray, such as tennis legend Martina Navratilova, and in so doing have had a lot of flack. Even for someone like her, who as an out lesbian was something of a trailblazer in her time. Having the wrong opinion wasn't just an opinion you'd disagree with. According to some, it was disturbing, upsetting and deeply transphobic. That didn't stop others, such as Sharon Davis, MBE, adding their voices, but mostly people kept their heads down. In the short term, that can play into the campaigners' hands, because they get apparent wins, as cowardly institutions assume that the right thing to do is exactly what they're being told to do. But what we're seeing now, I think, time will tell, is that doesn't hold in the longer term, because actually reasonable people who want the best outcome are looking at some of these things and they intuitively conclude that what they're seeing just goes against a basic sense of fairness. A recent poll found that 51% of US adults opposed allowing athletes to compete on the basis of their gender identity, including biological males who participate in women's and girls' sports. Only 29% supported allowing transgender students to participate on the sports teams of the gender they identify with, while 20% were undecided. Ultimately, that brings the issue back onto the table. Part of the problem is that the two sides of the discussion are framing the issue in completely different ways. This often happens when there's a contentious debate, where if you can frame it in your way, then you end up with the strongest arguments. So the trans activists are framing it as a rights issue. You have a human right recognised at the highest level to be able to play sport. So if trans women are prevented from doing so, that is a denial of their rights. And obviously, if you're the kind of person who will deny people their human rights based on a protected characteristic, that makes you, well, a disreputable sort. Well, people use different terms, we'll stick with that one. This is how cyclist Rachel McKinnon puts it. By preventing trans women from competing or requiring them to take medication, you're denying their human rights. So that's a fairly hard line, that the medication requirement is also a sufficiently high position to come into the human rights field. She also makes this reference to the International Olympics Committee. The IOC has 7 fundamental principles of Olympism in its Olympic Charter. Number 4 begins, the practice of sport is a human right. It is a human right to be able to compete. I will continue to show up. Now, of course, the right to play sports is not one of those listed in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is about the big picture negative rights that we have. You know, the right not to be held in slavery, not to be killed, not to be subjected to torture and so on. While there are references under broader human rights categories to the right to rest and leisure and the right to take part in cultural life, there's nothing that specifically relates to taking part in elite sports. So the Olympic Charter is framing a principle, not drawing from a universally recognised human right per se. Let's take a look at the full wording of the clause that McKinnon is quoting. The practice of sport is a human right. Every individual must have the possibility of practicing sport without discrimination of any kind and in the Olympic spirit, which requires mutual understanding with a spirit of friendship, solidarity and fair play. In the spirit of fair play is a key component, and one that is repeated through other Olympic documents, including the statement, fair play is the spirit of sport. And this is confirmed in the IOC's Transgender guidelines, which, although the details of implementation have been criticised as being inconsistent and not based on evidence, the principles could not be more clear. The overriding sporting objective is and remains the guarantee of fair competition. Restrictions on participation are appropriate to the extent that they're necessary and proportionate to the achievement of that objective. Very, very clear. And this has been a key principle for a long time. It's not some exception that's just been invented to do down trans women athletes. Many sports started with men's sport. Women were excluded for reasons of safety and fairness, alongside almost certainly some less noble motives. And increasingly now there are women's leagues and categories that preserve those aspects of safety and fairness, but also meeting the goal of inclusion. The same goes for disabled athletes. If you were in a wheelchair, then traditionally you wouldn't be playing elite tennis. But now there is a wheelchair tennis tournament. And then the same for children. Andy Murray won the Junior US Open before he won the adult version. The question isn't whether you have a human right to take part in sport. Nobody is stopping anybody from doing that. The question is, if you want to perform at the elite level, on what basis do you get to take part in what category, if at all? And the if at all sounds harsh, but very few earn the right to participate in sports at the elite level, and for all sorts of reasons. So while we would like to find an inclusive outcome that accommodates all people who want to reach the pinnacle of human achievement, we have to see if that can be done. It's worth as well noting the other distinction when it comes to rights. When we're talking basic human rights, they're inalienable. Your right to life doesn't interfere with my right to life. Your right to freedom from slavery and to own property doesn't interfere with my right to freedom and property. But when you come to these softer secondary rights, you get conflicts where you can intrude on someone else's rights without having acted wrongly, because there may be inbuilt conflict between opposing sets of rights. And this is where a lot of contentious issues live. In the sporting context, it's the clash between the rights of female-bodied players to play against other female-bodied players against those of male-bodied players who want to compete as females. There are many women who play sport only so long as they can do so with other females, and their right to do so is infringed if male-bodied players are granted the rights to play in women's teams. Sorting out those clashes of rights has to involve something a bit more reasonable than jumping up and down, shouting that your rights definitely take precedence, which is sometimes how it goes. So far then, we've identified these 3 key values: safe, fair and inclusive. In his presentation to the discussion by World Rugby of its trans athletes policy, Dr. John Pike, chair of the British Philosophy of Sports Federation, said that if you were looking at the ethical duties of a sporting body, these values are not all equal. So for instance, if they were all equal, you might well decide that you should just balance them against each other, which might mean you go for a little less fairness and a little less safety in order to achieve a little more inclusion. Dr. Pike says that isn't the right approach, and that instead you should sort them in order of their lexical priority. The first obligation, he says, is safety, and you shouldn't be trading safety off against other principles. We might decide to do that in our own lives as individuals, but sporting bodies in the 21st century are not going to do that. The second then is fairness, given its status within the IOC as being an overriding aim of sport, which is what it says. So the obvious implication is that fair competition can override inclusion, which is exactly what we see in how these sports have been governed historically. Let's deal quickly with what does or doesn't make this fair. There is one paper that gets quoted sometimes by trans activists, which is this one. And the part they quote is this: currently, there is no direct or consistent research suggesting transgender female individuals or male individuals have an athletic advantage at any stage of their transition, e.g. cross-sex hormones, gender-confirming surgery. Which sounds pretty conclusive, so maybe we should just move on. Except, if you're looking at a contentious area like this, you should read the full paper, not just one sentence from the abstract. And this paper doesn't provide anything even addressing that statement. I mean, there's such a remarkable disconnect between the substance of the research and that sentence. It's kind of hard to understand what it's even doing there. The paper is a review of the literature, and the 8 papers it reviewed were nearly all based on small numbers of interviews with trans athletes. And it talked about what were the primary barriers to participation and what sort of experiences trans athletes had had. He then noted that policies tended not to be evidence-based. And all of that seems to be fine, and the suggestion that policies need to be reviewed in the light of the evidence followed perfectly well as a stream of logic. And then suddenly in the abstract, that random statement is dropped in, with absolutely no connection to anything that had come before or any of the evidence provided in the paper. So, let's go on to what solid evidence and argument there is elsewhere. In terms of the standard differences in performance between men and women, here's how it plays out across a range of different sports. There's a significant gap in all sports, but in sports where the lower body is dominant, there's a smaller gap than in sports where upper body strength is much more of a factor. If you look at world records in athletics events, men are 10 to 15% better. In areas such as weightlifting and powerlifting, men are 45 to 55% better. Performance gaps in team sports are more difficult to tie down, but people often place significance on the fact that famously the World Cup winning USA women's football team lost 5-2 against the Dallas Academy boys team, whose age was around 15. You shouldn't get too excited about one result, however embarrassing, but you would expect the difference to be a real one, even if it can't be reliably quantified. Men have 40 to 60% more muscle mass, and even more than that in their upper body. And it's not just about size, height. A smaller man will still be stronger than a larger woman. Historically in this discussion, there's been lots of focus on testosterone levels and other hormonal factors, with a big focus on what can be suppressed to close the gap and therefore make it fair. And some people go into great detail about what percentage is typical in trans athletes, but the real challenge comes down to a basic physical reality. If people have transitioned from male to female after they've gone through puberty, then they retain significant advantage regardless of their hormone levels. This paper, published just a few months ago, studied the physical impacts on a number of trans men and trans women of cross-hormone treatment, specifically muscle composition and strength. For trans women, they found that over 12 months, muscle volume decreased 5% and there was no change in isometric strength. So after a year of treatment, trans women retained a 48% strength advantage, with 35% larger quad muscles than biological women. 50 to 70% of the advantage came from greater height, but even when you corrected for height advantage, there was still a 22% strength advantage. This confirmed a number of previous studies that had looked at similar changes, so approximately 5% loss, leaving a 25% overall advantage. By the way, these weren't athletes. There's every chance that with regular training the muscle loss would be even less. And this was just for muscle mass. Trans women who transition after puberty also keep advantages in terms of height, width, bone size, heart strength and lung capacity. So you can argue all you like about testosterone levels and other hormonal factors, but it's pretty solidly established that the intuitive reaction people have when they see some of those pictures reflects as a response to a real imbalance, not just a perceived one. If we're taking that principle with safety, then fairness, then inclusion, those differences are certainly enough to trigger the safety consideration when it comes to contact sports, which is why World Rugby is moving apparently towards a ban. It's a dilemma typified by trans woman rugby player Kelly Morgan. She has taken a daily dose of the female hormone estrogen for the past 18 months at the point where this article was published last year. At nearly 6 foot, she stands out amongst her teammates, and club captain Jessica Minty Madley recounts a time she folded an opponent like a deck chair. Kelly, 33, accepts transgender women may have an advantage in terms of size and strength. I do feel guilty, but what can you do, she says. I don't go out to hurt anybody, I just want to play rugby. The team founder, Brian Minty, said she's going to be a good player for the next few years as long as we can stop her injuring players in training. It's hard to see this issue settling down at a place where those sorts of injuries are simply accepted as the cost of inclusion. You would argue that inclusion would mean that female-bodied players should be able to take part without enhanced risk of injury. I wouldn't think that was a radical statement, would you? So if that's a key factor for contact sports, the question for the rest is that one of fairness. It's worth noting that at the elite sport level, sporting bodies go to great lengths to eliminate unfair advantage, because the difference between first and second place is often measured in fractions of a percent. Really, the tiniest difference can be everything at the elite level. It's why there are rules about what types of disabilities are or are not eligible for para-sporting events. It's why when certain teams were innovating their way to an advantage in Formula One, they introduced restrictions and rules about how much could be spent and other things designed to force a more level playing field. It's why the World Athletics Council banned the use of the new highly performance-enhancing Nike Alpha Fly trainers from competition. So of course, this area is ultimately going to follow the same principles, because why would it be the one exception? Now, there are a number of additional arguments that it's worth considering. First, when told that they have an unfair advantage, competitors like McKinnon often say that they can't have an unfair advantage because they don't always win. It's not as though they're always laying waste of a competition with a huge performance gap between them. Now, first of all, that doesn't give you any sort of principle that you can work with, because certain trans athletes have achieved a bigger gap, so then the question becomes, where do you draw the line? But it isn't a point anyway. You can have an unfair advantage and still not win everything. If an athlete is discovered to have been, for instance, doping to enhance performance, they don't only disqualify them if they won the race. They do it automatically because they had an unfair advantage, even if it wasn't enough to get them over the line. It's the principle of fairness, that overriding thing. In response to that, the activists will sometimes point out that there are lots of advantages that are tolerated by sports. Take a look at Michael Phelps. It may be because of a happy accident at birth, that the man was very lucky when he was swimming in the gene pool and his natural build gives him a clear lead on the rest, and that's very unfair on all the others who have to resign themselves apparently to compete only for second place. And it's true, in many ways elite sports full of unfair advantages in that sort of a way. We have no choice but to accept the accident to birth advantages. It's not the same as permitting systemic advantages that come from a controllable external process. Dr. John Pike said that there are 3 key differences between trans women and some other advantage, for instance the advantage of height. One is that in this case the advantage is significant and systematic. Height is an advantage in basketball, for instance, but some shorter, highly skilled players still manage to maximise those skills to find their niche and to compete. The second is whether the advantage comes in a continuum or as a binary. Height is a continuum, while biological sex obviously is not. And thirdly, he points out that less tall athletes aren't coming from a history of significant inequality and disadvantage, because women have been excluded from most sports for most of history. In many sports, they're only now starting to emerge within their own competitive field. And there are still lots of obstacles to be overcome. Progress is being made. Applying male-bodied advantage to that field seems unjust, simply from that perspective. I would add the simple observation of my own, that like British justice, this is a process that has to be not just fair, but seen to be fair. Trans athletes themselves understandably complain about the catch-22 they find themselves in. If they don't win, they're accepted. When they do win, everyone says it wasn't fair. I have huge sympathy for how that must feel. Determined activists like Rachel McKinnon may be happy to blast their way through, simply take on all the naysayers, but it ends up in an unsatisfactory and unsustainable position long term for everyone. Because it's never going to go away. That's not just about getting people to accept a new normal. That intuitive and instinctive perception of unfairness is built in to how humans see the world. So where does this leave us? Ultimately, if we take all the anger and the venom and the knee-jerk reactions out of all of this, we should be able to see what's happening here, which is that society is changing. We need to work out a place where it can settle and be stable, and that will only come when people see an outcome that feels fair. It will no doubt involve much debate and trial and error among the community that most cares about sport. But I find myself attracted to the conclusion that Dr. Pike put forward to the World Rugby meeting on this. He said this: "The division of sport ought to reflect and be written around bodies. Hence it ought to recognise male advantage and protect women's sport from those with male advantage. There should therefore be a protected female category of sport, which excludes everyone with male advantage. It's optional whether those who lack male advantage compete in this category, but they are welcome to do so. For example, socially transitioning trans men. There should then be an open category in which everyone and anyone is able to compete. This category would be open to obviously male and female bodied athletes, to trans men and trans women. It would not be a gender-defined category or a sex-defined category. This is a matter of eligibility criteria only. Instituting these categories would be maximally inclusive. It would enable everyone who is currently able to compete in a category that provides them access to fair sport. You could see how subsports would have open categories, maybe with subdivisions by weight or height or some other factor, or maybe for sports like tennis, no further division at all. For me, it deals as elegantly as may be possible with the challenge as it's posed. In any event, I find it a valuable proposition because at least it gives us a starting point that isn't purely about who can shout the loudest.